if we support our clinicians, they're going to give better patient care. And ultimately, that's exactly what every institution is here for. That if you have to make the connection between the emotional wholeness of the physician or of any of the clinicians, and they're translating that into patient care. And I think it's very hard to argue against that. And I think there's plenty of literature out there to show that clinicians are hurting, and that the business as usual of assuming everybody's strong and doesn't need to deal with this or doesn't need any extra support or they can get support from their family is just not borne out in reality.
So the impact of an error or an adverse event upon a clinician, I've listed here. This is a list that was compiled by some pioneers in the work. And they're all totally understandable, and each and every person who has sustained an adverse event goes through these motions at one point or another, but underlying them all is this feeling of incredible loneliness, that they're out there twisting at the end of the yardarm, and it's that we hope to support in a much healthier way.
The patient was a friend of mine. She's a nurse at the hospital, took care of both of my kids when they were born, and she came in with a parotid tumor. It was a much more difficult resection than I anticipated. When we got to the recovery room, her smile wasn't symmetric anymore, so my stomach fell down to the floor. This was a known complication. You know, this is something that we had talked about before. I went over the case in my head, you know, over and over and over again. You know, what did I do? Where did the problem happen? Did I do anything that was inappropriate or wrong, or how could I have avoided this problem? You know, that was part of it, and part of it was just feeling miserable because, you know, I'd done something horrible to somebody I cared about.
When I was a fellow in critical care, I made a decision to take a breathing tube out of a patient, a decision that turned out to be the wrong decision. And after we took it out, we relatively urgently needed to put it back in, and that was difficult. The patient didn't get oxygen for a while and suffered a hypoxic brain injury. You know, fortunately, in the long term, they recovered, but right after the event, I remember vividly looking at the patient's wife, and she had tears in her eyes and was clearly upset. And I felt absolutely miserable. I felt absolutely horrible with no path to resolution, because back then, and to some extent now, doctors weren't supposed to make mistakes, right? It wasn't something I was free to do. And so I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't either heal the patient's wife, I couldn't heal myself, and importantly, we couldn't use any of the tools that we know now work well to learn from the mistake.
So in an effort to better support our clinicians, Janet Barnes, Rick Van Pelt, and Andrea Stetson, who's from our EAP group, got together and developed a peer support task force, out of which came a team based on several principles. First of all, we had to mount a very credible support system. It had to be immediately available. It was totally a voluntary proposition, highly confidential, anonymous, and designed to provide emotional first aid, not extended psychotherapy. It's in real time, at the time, but to facilitate access to those support structures that may in fact be required or needed going forward. And to that end, we trained almost 40 individuals who were volunteered their services to be available on a 24/7 basis. And in fact, since it's been launched in '06, there are basically 2 to 5 one-on-one sessions every month. There have been at least 10 group sessions each year that have affected about 150 of our caregivers on the staff. And it provides ultimately service to the entire Brigham community, all caregivers that may be exposed. The Joint Commission, as you know, has come on board. They require that hospitals make these support systems available. And the National Quality Forum, the 8th Safe Practice, also encourages involved caregivers to receive timely and systemic care. So I think we've come a long way in providing that support. We've got a long way to go, but I think we've got a structure, at least out there, that is a step in the right direction. Apology and disclosure, another element of a compassionate, caring community, is something that we certainly weren't trained to embrace. In fact, quite the opposite. As Peter Pronovost said, we were trained to be self-reliant, totally self-sufficient, autonomous, worried about job security if you did, in fact, admit to an error. And, of course, the specter of litigation is always behind any adverse event.
I think the head surgeon is lost. He approached me, I don't want to say this badly, but as if I were a piece of meat that he had just sewn up, and if I would ask him, as I say, if I'd ask him a direct question, I would get we might say, an indirect answer. For example, the colostomy, I asked him, would I have to live with it, or could I have another operation? And his answer would be, that's up to me. Well, I mean, I don't know enough to make such a decision, and I would expect a surgeon to explain carefully the ramifications of one thing or another. And in terms of compassion or understanding another person's sensitivity, he did not make any effort to do that with me. You have no idea how far a sorry will go.
So not only does the patient feel alone, but the caregiver feels alone as well. And how do we help them, in fact, say they're sorry when this is not something that any of us do easily? To admit to an error or a mistake is a tough thing to do. So how do we help? Patients basically want to know three consistent elements. They want to know that you're sincerely sorry about what happened. They would like to know what the sequence of events were that led up to the event as best as you understand it at the time, and they want to know it then, right then, not 3 weeks later, not 6 months later. And they want to know what the steps are going to be that you're going to take to prevent this happening again. And if you can just begin to get that across, you also begin to restore the trust that's been eroded. And that's so critical to going forward, as many of you in this room have experienced. We partnered with Bob Truog's Institute for Professionalism and Ethical Practice. And again, we trained over 30 of our staff members who volunteered for this to learn how to say I'm sorry and to coach people, to be with them or on the other end of the phone, whatever it takes when an adverse event occurs. The National Quality Forum also has embraced this, number 7, following serious unanticipated outcomes, timely, transparent, and clear communication. And the Joint Commission requires that the hospital now inform the patient again in a timely fashion. So there's a very clear-cut mandate that underscores the viability of a very structured apology and disclosure program. And there's very clear-cut evidence from the University of Michigan that it reduces the claims asserted as well as the dollars lost by as much as 50%. The final element of our program is to support our new defendants. Those of you who have experienced this know that it's extraordinarily uncomfortable. And speaking of being twisting in the wind,
finding out that you're being sued, I think it's kind of analogous to hearing that you have cancer. You're basically told this, and then whatever anyone says after that, just swims by.
I felt very ashamed and very embarrassed. It was unbelievable. I don't know quite how to put it. I was stunned. I was very ashamed. I mean, what kind of an example does that set for your peers?
To have somebody say such horrible, mean things about you it's like a stab in the heart.
What we seek to develop is a sense of trust. And I think when you're named in a lawsuit as a defendant, you feel as though the very essence of what you're trying to do has been disrupted. Your relationship with a patient has been shattered.
And throughout the tracing, there's
people imagine that physicians are resilient, they can handle anything, that they're able to tolerate death and pain and suffering, but when they're personally accused of having done some harm and having done it in a willful way, which is what often happens in a malpractice suit, it's beyond anything that they themselves expected. They expect themselves to be able to continue to be resilient, and they're often surprised at how vulnerable they feel.
Anger, shame, guilt, vulnerability, self-doubt, depression, all of the above in various mixtures are characteristics of the response to being sued. And again, that common denominator, they feel alone. So to try to support them going through this, we have several sessions, this one most recently, where we opened up a forum for new defendant support to explain the process and give that support. CRICO and RMF have been wonderful in joining with us in several of these sessions with our staff. And a group of us who have been through this experience have gotten together with CRICO, and we are on call 24/7 again to help people who have a recent claim filed. So the process is that when CRICO notifies our risk management department, Janet Barnes, risk management then notifies the defendant right then and there, offers her counsel and the resources available through CRICO, which are substantial, and informs the defendant of the support system that we have in place. Joe and I and Janet send out another letter to the defendant with our names offering our support. And we've recently decided to go ahead with a phone call and reach out one more time. And it's fascinating because we've had members of our staff come up and say, you know, just getting that letter was enough. That really helped. Just knowing that you're there makes a huge difference. So the emotional impact of an adverse event, its subsequent disclosure and potential litigation is reflected, again, in that common response, I feel alone. And we're here to help mitigate that response. And as Dave alluded before dinner, you know, we're all patients. We're all caregivers. We're in this boat together. So let's try to take very good care of each other. And I thank you very much for this privilege. I told you she won't let go.
Before you head out, there's a couple of housekeeping, but I wanted you to be here because I thought after his trauma, he needed a little something. So, thank you.
Stay around. I'm going to need some help.